Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Pérez Art Museum, Miami. My name is Adrienne Chadwick, and I'm the Deputy Director of Education here at PAMM. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Artist Sarah Oppenheimer will discuss S28-1913, her newly commissioned work for PAMM's Meyerhoff Greene Focus Gallery. Bridging art, architecture, cognitive science, and philosophy, Oppenheimer's work generates striking perceptual effects through modification to architectural settings, heightened awareness of the way we understand and experience the spaces we inhabit. S28-1913 will be on view through April 30th, 2017. Tonight, Sarah will be speaking with René Morales, PAMM Curator, who worked with her to realize her new project for PAMM. Their discussion will be followed by a short Q&A. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. René Morales is curator at Pérez Art Museum, where he has organized over 36 exhibitions, including Global Positioning Systems, Victoria Gitman, Desiring Eye, Monica Sosnowska, Market, and A Human Document, sections from the Sackner Archive of Concrete and Visual Poetry. René received a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College and a master's degree in art history from Brown University. Prior to joining PAMM, he worked at the Museum of Art Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. Sarah Oppenheimer received an MFA from Yale University in Connecticut. Solo exhibitions of her work have been presented at multiple institutions, including Madame Luxembourg, Kunsthaus, Baseland, Switzerland, Baltimore Museum of Art, St. Louis Art Museum, Queens Museum of Art, New York, the Drawing Center, New York. A major solo project by Oppenheimer will be presented in 2017 at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, and in 2019 at Mass MoCA. Her work has been included in group exhibitions at the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston, Site Santa Fe, the Andy Warhol Museum, Pittsburgh, the Hessel Museum of Art, New York, Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, Sculpture Center, New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego, White Columns, New York. Oppenheimer is a recipient of a Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming René Morales and Sarah Oppenheimer.
Hello.
Hello. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming, René Morales and Sarah Oppenheimer. So we have a lot to talk about tonight, and I'd like to leave some time for questions at the end. But before we start, I just wanted to say publicly to everyone that it has been just such a pleasure working with Sarah Oppenheimer and her very skilled team. We have Naomi Mackey and Levi Murphy sitting up right here in the front row. And I just want to thank you guys for the incredible effort and collegiality that you brought to this project. So it's been wonderful.
Can I say a few words of thanks before we?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I just want to say one thing about the project upstairs. This project has had many, many, many incredibly creatively brilliant people involved, and would not be possible without their not just involvement, but total devotion to making this come to pass in ways that are really extraordinary. So I want to first really just, I can't even tell you guys in the front row here, Naomi and Levi, tell you I am just so incredibly grateful, and I've just learned a tremendous amount from you, and the amount of sort of creative, intellectual work that the two of you have put into this is not evident in any way from the simple signage. These two people, this is very much work that they have made in every way. So I also want to say we're incredibly fortunate tonight to have Alex Orlando and Patricia here to join us. Alex is the machinist who has made all of the parts, all of the aluminum and steel parts that are within the kinetic objects / elements upstairs. And it's extraordinary to me that you've come, but it's been a kind of transformational experience working with you, Alex. You've just devoted an incredible amount to making this thing occur. And we were also extraordinarily fortunate. There was a team of engineers on this project that made this project occur, specifically run by Hauke Junghogen from Thornton Tomasetti. One of the engineers, the primary, I'd say, the most involved engineer was someone named James Richardson, who came down here last weekend to do our first kinetic test. It was extraordinarily surprising to me that he put in the time and effort of his own volition to simply come see this thing operate. I can't even tell you how much time and energy was spent collaboratively working on that. And that is not even beginning to touch the surface of the number of people involved. The Wexner Center for the Arts, I've been in residence there for 2 years. The Wexner Center was sort of the seed, the germination of this project and probably projects for years to come, where for the past 2 years they've been supporting creative research in my studio and with Alex and the engineers as well to develop a rotation system, which we'll talk about briefly tonight. And I also want to say an extraordinarily large thanks to the people at the Pérez, first and foremost to René, who has at every turn sort of met with great odds and worked with me to develop ways to make this happen. Jay Ore, who don't know if you're here, but I owe you a huge thank you for your perseverance and work making this project occur with a team of extraordinary individuals who all basically spent the last 2 weeks underground in the floor cavity of that gallery with us. And Megan Kavanagh from the Wexner, who we're incredibly lucky to have tonight. So this list is really extensive, but I want to just tell you, thank you so much.
Okay.
That was a little bit long.
Thank
but
you
it
for
was
bearing with us.
Very important.
This has been,
this process.
you know, this project has, everything went very smoothly. There were a lot of challenges, and we met them as it went along. But you know, the last few days have just been a total like love fest, as you can tell, between the crew and the artist team. It's just been again such a pleasure working together. So thank you for bearing with us. But you know, before we start, I wanted to start by kind of zooming out a little bit, panning out to a couple of the broader ideas that your work grapples with. And I think as we go through the specific projects, I hope the way in which you work with these ideas will become more clear. But among the kind of constellation of ideas that you are interested in, or some that I'm very interested in as well, that I always have been interested in, having to do with perception. The ways in which we take the visual information provided by, or the sensory information provided by our senses, and the way our brains take that information and turn it into a conceptual understanding of the world. Basically, the ways that this sensory information becomes our minds. You know, there's a lot of theory, a lot of philosophy in many different disciplines that deals with this very large, very important, fascinating, and very complicated subject. But the thing about your work is that your work makes us actually experience those ideas. And I think probably the best way to develop that further is to talk about some specific pieces. And I thought it would be good to start with the Baltimore piece. So Sarah, if you could just kind of walk us through. Here you go.
So I'm going to try to speed through this so that we have time to talk about the piece that's installed here. This is an element that is installed within the wall and plenum space that bridges, I would say, 3 contemporary gallery spaces within the Baltimore Museum of Art. And one of the most important features of this work is that as you move across the field, it basically changes in response to where you are located in relation not only to it, but in relation to its adjacent locations. So this is a view from the 2nd floor out on the lower corner towards the atrium space, which is a daylit space, which is why it's quite blue, and also simultaneously a reflection to the floor below you, which is seen here. And this is a view looking from that lower floor up back into the collections gallery overhead. A lot of the work, just to say very briefly, has grown out of an interest into what I think of as a kind of generic set of spatial conditions, and I like the notion that space is organized often in similar ways. I think of that generic condition, or I talk about that generic condition as something that I refer to that as the array. I think often a project will begin, and this project here at the Pérez has begun by thinking about how spaces are arranged, how the architectural envelope is organized. So how do you start in one place and then progress into another place? And I have labeled these locations as sort of with generic labels, such as A, B, C, D. And obviously this is more complicated when you have multiple floors adjacent to one another. And most important, I think, growing out of this idea is a very sort of rudimentary, simple notion, which is that in spite of the fact that there are spatial incongruities that we experience, we sort of stitch those incongruities together in such a way that allows us to experience them as totally congruous, such as when we play Pac-Man, we exit one side of the screen, we enter the other side of the screen. We experience those spaces as if they're connected, when in fact, obviously, here we see they're not.
So just a little bit more on the array concept. What are some of the factors, the real world conditions that determine or create a sense of differentiation between different sections within the array?
So I think that the idea initially grew out of imagining that basic notion that one room is next to another room. And I was really looking specifically at interior space. And over time, that's become more complex, partially because the spaces I've been asked to engage with are all very different from one another, but they share similar features, such as they often have walls or floors or ceilings. And so that sameness then becomes a defining factor for how the work evolves.
I think we should go back a little bit. So I've always liked this picture here. If you imagine yourself sort of standing on a ledge, one of these ledges here, you have very little awareness of the space and the qualities of the space on the opposite side of that form. And you have very little awareness, you tend to have little awareness of the ways in which those two spaces relate to each other, how they're divided. So it's like our minds are very good at picking up on the different qualities of each of these spaces. But our minds are not so good at remembering exactly how they are stitched together, how they relate to each other. So I think in works like the Baltimore piece, there's this moment of realization where, like, oh my God, that atrium that I walked through, half an hour ago, it happens to be just literally on the other side of this wall, or happens to be literally above me, or something like that. So there's this moment of realization when you start to actually understand the differential between the ways that your mind perceives and remembers a space and what the space actually is. So I think, I just wanted to underscore that concept because it's something that comes up very strongly, I think, in the PAMM piece. And, it also came up strongly in in this work here that you recently completed in Switzerland. You want to talk about this one a little bit?
This was the first piece where what was both a kind of aperture that one looked through was also something that one passed through. And it was a highly light-dependent work that was not based on a simple idea of a reflective plane. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how light is working in this piece to clarify what I'm referring to. So the glass in this work was very similar to the glass that's upstairs. It's basically a window glass, a coated window glass. And one of the things that was striking about it is that because the light was hitting it at a very regular angle, it happened to be very reflective on one face of the glass. So if you were on one side, it was always reflective, and if you were on the opposite side, it was pretty much always transparent. And in fact, what's happening here is you have an opening that has a large piece of glass that's oriented at 45 degrees to the threshold space. So it appears as if it's kind of closing this threshold, but in fact, it's basically bisecting it as a clear plane. And I'll just say a little bit about how this was operationalized. You had a very long gallery, and the light from the gallery was really coming in from one primary wall. The long rectangle above was a wall of windows, and what it meant was that the sunlight that was entering the gallery really hit these dividing walls, which you're seeing intersecting with the space at 45 degrees on one side, creating a very illuminated surface. When that illuminated surface was then made out of a transparent material, or what we refer to as a transparent material such as glass, it meant that one face of that glass was very reflective. And it meant that when you looked through that space or through those thresholds, rather than seeing through the opening, your sightline passed across that glass plane and it bounced your vision out to the space beyond.
So when was it that I first contacted you? It must have been about 2 years ago. I think your first trip down here was about 1.5 years ago, right? So Sarah and I started working together, and we began with trading floor plans of the PAMM building, which Sarah studied very carefully, very exactingly, and she made a couple of trips down to Miami to experience the building for herself. And I wonder, Sarah, if you could just tell us a little bit about your first impressions of the building and some of the kind of more conceptual takeaways that you drew from the architecture.
So I think I'm going to move forward here. I think this was a really exciting building to engage with for a number of reasons. It was in some ways the first opportunity I've had to deal with a building that was or is so current in its architectural relevance, I would say, within the discipline of architecture itself, within dialogues around architecture. It has, in that sense, created a whole host of really exciting challenges, also because I think this building at this present moment, or at the moment of 2 years ago, has really in some ways established a change in how museums operate and function. And so it really pushed me to think about the possibility of responding to an envelope that behaved differently as a social organism. The other thing about this building is that there's a whole host of infrastructural actions that the building is performing which we don't see, which I think have really shaped what is happening in the gallery. One of the things that has struck me in first visiting is that there's a series of concrete boxes that are interspersed, and they're basically these dead-end spaces that were designed for solo shows that are located on these kind of peripheral areas of the museum. And then there's this sort of processional space which allows visitors to kind of meander through what is the collections gallery. This is a floor plan of the second floor. But in spite of the seeming openness of this, it's highly organized around the grid. And that grid is not just emphasized by the walls and the orthogonal sort of rectilinear rooms, but it's also organized and I think emphasized strongly by the lighting grid, which is really interestingly, I think, a very strong and recurring feature of Herzog de Meuron's recent contemporary art buildings, such as specifically Schaulager and also now the Tate Switch House. And I find that kind of recursion very linked to how we think about the possibility of sameness, and specifically the idea of the array. So I was extremely interested in the grid, which I have been for a long time, both the structural grid and the infrastructural grid. And one of the things, I'm just going to say a few more words about this. One of the things that has often will accompany architectural plans, for those of you who are architects, you probably know more about this than I do, but regularly these plans have grid lines, and the drawings are organized around grid lines. So here, what you're seeing is you're seeing the grid lines of the building that accompany the CAD files or the DWGs of the plan. And you'll notice that not only is it not a square grid, but the columns don't fall on every intersection of the grid line. And that is a kind of unusual condition. Nonetheless, the grid is very regular and very dominant in terms of the organization of the space.
Just going back quickly, the lines that you see here, that actually corresponds with the lighting grid. So as you walk through the building, this grid that Sarah is talking about is actually viewable directly above your heads. It's a kind of aspect of architecture that we are rarely aware of, the ways that the infrastructure shapes the spaces that we walk through. And I think that's yet another whole field of things that I've learned from your work have to do with not just the way that we perceive and misperceive spaces in relation to each other, but also, again, these kinds of buried or secret registers in which a building functions. So I think this kind of analysis just immediately really interested me when Sarah first started talking to me about it. So going back to this grid here, I was really interested with this moment when Sarah started experimenting with the possibility of reorienting this grid. So Sarah, if you could talk about this image.
Sure, and I actually want to say one other thing about the buried spaces of the museum, that often the buried space of a museum will either be in the walls or in the ceiling cavity. So there'll be a lot of electric running in the ceiling cavity or a lot of HVAC. And something really remarkable about this building is that that is actually now in the floor plane. And so there's this bubble of space underneath us, which is basically a huge air pressure cavity that's being slowly leaking out of these grates that are happening in the corners. And the piece really uses that bubble of space and is very attuned to that problem. So I will say briefly here about this slide, I've become increasingly interested in rotating the grid lines of the building, because in some ways, if we're not dealing with kind of vertical reorientation, I think the rotation of the primary axes of the building causes a shift in how you orient your body in relation to where you are. And that is not only true in this project, it was true at Kunsthaus Baseland, and is a very dominant feature at the Wexner, and has been sort of evolved through thinking about grid lines and shifting grid lines as a strategy of reorienting the body in relation to location.
Yeah, that's a really key point, I think, that these kinds of grid lines that are cooked into a building have the effect of actually controlling your body, and certainly have the effect of controlling your sight line and your perception, and thus your consciousness, your awareness, your understanding of the space. So, but please continue. Yeah.
So I'm going to say a few more things about the location. So this is a diagram of the gallery upstairs in which the artwork's located, and these are the 45-degree rotated grid lines. And a 45-degree angle in reflection is the kind of basic premise of a periscope. It creates a 90-degree reflection. And so that gallery in particular interested me because the two threshold spaces, one being a passable threshold, which is the door, and the other being a not passable threshold, which is the window, could be joined by a sight line between them if the axis of vision was reflected across a 45-degree angle.
That's the doorway at the top and the window toward the bottom, just so you can orient yourself there.
And that's the kind of residual sight line. And I will say something else that's been very critical in my thinking about these sight lines, which is that we're not only talking about a static or fixed looking, we're talking about the process of looking in motion and the process of moving and orienting oneself as one is moving. So these are simple diagrams looking at how the field of vision changes as you move around an obstruction, such as a column. And perhaps you want to...
And well, you know, one of the discussions that Sarah and I bonded over early in this process was when we talked about J.J. Gibson, who's a perception psychologist. This is this image really typifies the kinds of theories that he's known for, having to do with the optical field. This idea that we don't just perceive objects in our environment, we perceive them only in relation to its surroundings. And further, we only perceive them in motion as we move around. You know, as this is called optic flow. As you are making your way through this optic field, some objects will start to appear larger, some will distort in different ways, and those differences that happen are key to your understanding of what that object is, what it's about, what it's made out of, how much it weighs, everything, every aspect of the building. And one of the points that Gibson often stressed is that perception does not just happen on a lateral plane. Perception is more complicated in that sense. It happens three-dimensionally. It happens vertically as well as horizontally. He was a pilot, actually. He started as someone who was testing pilots for the military and training pilots during World War II and Korea, I believe. And in the process, you know, that's where a lot of his ideas kind of stem from. So this is a famous diagram that, of course, relates to the challenge, the optical, perceptual challenge of landing a plane. So anyway, Sarah, if you want to talk about sort of your relationship or the relationship in your work with this concept of perception happening, again, not just on a lateral plane, but sort of freed from that single register, and how that kind of relates to your past works and also to the work that you've installed here at PAMM.
So that's so fascinating, because I didn't know that Gibson was a pilot, and that makes sense, because I always thought that this was a kind of extension of the diagram of the bird in flight. So to understand, one very critical issue in Gibson is the centrality of the ground plane for him, and how the ground plane is the register of orientation. And so that any kind of fluctuation or change in our perception of the ground plane causes a change in our orientation to the space we inhabit. And that was a very resonant idea in a number of my pieces that I've kind of brought to projects. And I think one of the things that I had started to play with, particularly in 2009, was the possibility of taking that ground plane and tipping that ground plane up without changing the ground plane of perception. So this project, which was completed at Anneli Judah in London, was basically a tipped ground plane, which one could walk under and then also walk or look through. And I became interested here at the Pérez in thinking, what happens if instead of simply rotating the sight lines or shifting the sight lines across a reflected plane, which kept the line of vision at eye level so that we were always seeing at the same height, what happens if we could shift or rotate that axis of vision without actually shifting or rotating the physical envelope of the room? And that was sort of the seed notion for this project. That basically became the core idea behind how one might tip or rotate the axis of orientation, not simply at 45 degrees in plan, but also at 45 degrees in elevation. And this is a basic diagram of that problem. So I'll say a little bit more about this problem of rotation. These simple movies are diagrams of what does it mean for a planar element when looked at in plan to rotate. And one of the things that I think is extremely fascinating, which I want to thank Naomi Maki for generating as a conceptual tool.
Or discovering, really.
Yeah, discovering. I also want to credit, there was a really extraordinary student at the Wexner who led us towards this discovery, which I'll talk about momentarily. The first notion is that when you look at something rotating in plan, like a door, you have the residue of a circle. So you have a kind of circular path that you see that evolve in. But when you rotate something on a bias, in fact, you suddenly have a very different kind of path, and that path is not only stable in plan, which is seen in the upper left quadrant, but also in section, where what's actually happening is you're looking at it across it, and your path is suddenly now an ellipse. So our first experiments, which grew out of conversations at the Wexner, were looking at taking a box and rotating it on an axis. So this is a simple model that Naomi Levi and I built in the studio, looking at how that might work.
That's a PAMM gallery in the background, again with that axis rotated. It's actually a different gallery from the one that we ended up doing this project in. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
Yes, that gallery was very challenging because actually you can see from the diagram that the window and the doorway are aligned. So that window is currently blacked out, but when it isn't, you'll notice there's a direct sight line when you enter to the window. And then in working with the engineers at the, associated with the Wexner at Ohio State University, we started to develop a kind of more mechanical system. They machined these U-channel bars, which we siliconed to 2 glass planes, and made a simple motorized and then manually operated sort of rotational louver. But this led to yet another rotation. So not only did we become interested in rotating a planar element on a bias axis, but we started to play with the possibility of not having rectangular intersection conditions where the element would intersect with the axis of rotation at 90 degrees. So this was a prototype from studio of that problem. And I think Alex, who is in the audience tonight, this was your first involvement in this project. Alex was the first person to, and the only person actually, to really explore the possibility of how we might machine this complex geometry into aluminum material. And one thing I'll also say about this slide is you'll notice, or this little video, you'll notice at the top, the way these tubes are supported is around the outside of the tube. So there's a kind of bearing system that's running around the outside of that tubular element. But one thing that I think is also really fascinating about that is that the path, when traced, is now not only elliptical, but it's actually helixical when you have that double miter.
So there's this kind of interesting layering of complexity in terms of the geometries that are produced by the piece, right? When it came down to fabrication, I think there was another moment of discovery when you found that some of those geometries actually happen physically in the material that you're producing, right? So you just gave a shout out to Alex who helped fabricate the metal components. But I wonder if we could quickly go through a little bit more of the fabrication process in detail.
Yes, and I will say one other thing that is really striking is that part of the reason there is this recursion, and now we're going to talk extensively about this ellipse, is that it has to do with how a rotation can hit a plane at a non-90 degree axis. If you rotate something and it hits it at 90 degrees, you'll get a circle. But if you rotate something and it hits it at 45 or at 30, you get an ellipse. And that's also true with these axes of looking. So you have an elevation or a section, and that is also an intersection with a rotation that is not at 90 degrees.
Right. If someone holds up a hula hoop and you stand right in front of it, you'll see a circle. If you're standing off to the side, you'll see an ellipse. So.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the sort of receiving end of that small model. This was an early fabrication experiment where we played with the possibility of water jetting these parts. They turned the water jet head at 45 degrees to the material, but actually the problem with this element was that the tolerances were too loose. And it continued through the project, and it was a massive negotiation between myself, Levi, Naomi, Alex. How do we think about the orientation of the object in order for the object to be cut? And this notion of orientation then passed through every part within the process, because in order to cut it, you need to reorient the object on an XYZ axis. It also raised a number of structural questions. And particularly, that had to do with the discontinuity of the rotational axis. So the two sides, as you'll notice, of this element are not actually connected. There are two large pieces of glass bridging the two bearing systems. And as you may be aware, buildings are not static objects, they move. So the ceiling is moving, the floor is moving. When you have a very full room, when you have a lot of loading weather-wise, the building is not a stable form. So even if there is a perfect world where these things are structurally extraordinarily regular and rigid, they will change in relation to one another because of the movement of where they're connected to.
And not just that, if I could interject, of course, I mean, I think most of you know that floors are not exactly level. It's very rare to find an exactly level floor and exactly vertical wall or ceiling. So that greatly complicated the process of creating this piece, I think, particularly when you had to get that alignment between the two stems, the two shafts, exactly right. I mean, you had to be able to shoot a laser from the anchor plate, the lower anchor, to the top anchor, that would hit dead on within a tolerance of, a few millimeters or something. So anyway, yeah. So again, you were talking about the structural aspects of the composition here.
So this diagram is actually a structural analysis of the glass in rotation. This is a computational image provided to us by Thornton Tomasetti. But one of the things that I want to call attention to is not an analysis of the glass, but actually how tolerance is accommodated in the total system because of this specific misalignment. So you'll notice there's this big orange blob at the bottom of the element. That big orange blob refers to a type of bearing, which is what's called a spherical bearing. So the upper part of the element is totally aligned and rigid, but as it impacts the lower part no longer rotates, let's say, like a regular bearing would rotate, but it rotates more like a hip would rotate. So it allows for a kind of spherical motion. So this is a short movie of Naomi manipulating the spherical bearing. And you can see its range of motion is shockingly large.
By the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but by tolerance, I think what we mean basically is the degree to which you can fudge it. If you have to shoot a laser from the lower anchor into the top anchor and hit it within a few millimeters, there's very little tolerance. But if you can kind of, adjust it, or if there's room to play with it, then there is a little bit more. So you guys had to actually build in some tolerance into the system as much as you could, and that's one of the functions of this kind of almost hip-like joint, hip joint-like bearing here.
Exactly. So when they don't align, it can be picked up in the lower element. We then started to play with the possibility of how we would reorient these things in terms of their later assembly. This is the lower anchor element, and unlike the model that you saw where there was a kind of complexity around the tube, at this point all of this is then buried inside these large tubes. This is the upper kinetic element, which houses a series of bearings. And one of the things that really struck me over time is that this system, in fact, started to remind me of a kind of body where you have a spine with the tolerance on the exterior, because the exterior tube is going to be totally irregular in its thickness and in its dimensionality, whereas the interior threaded rod can have a kind of stability throughout its entire rotation. So you'll notice that there's this kind of central axis around which everything turns. The big question we ran into then was, how do we not only verify that these things align in space, but how do we verify that the axes of rotation are similar from the lower to the upper element? And we realized that if we actually just joined the two kind of plates without the glass, and we saw that they rotated continuously, we could at least see that in terms of how they were fabricated, there was a center line of rotation that was consistent. So this was a large part of our summer. We basically spent quite a lot of time in Massachusetts developing this rotation.
Pretty cool.
We were very excited when this actually spun. And then the problem, which was no small question, was how does this in fact engage with and enter this large building envelope? And that brings us to specifically, or back to the original problem of the grid of the building, the infrastructure of the building, and how in fact this could then live within the kind of more concealed locations of the building.
Well, if you pay attention to the lower right there, what you're looking at there is the lower anchor detail. Actually, originally we were actually thinking of cutting through this architectural slab, not just the wood, but what we call the architectural slab that doesn't have any rebar in it, and it was not strong enough to support the weight of this piece. So that we could then anchor into what's called the structural slab about a couple feet beneath that. I'm being a bit imprecise with my measurements, but which is intended to hold greater weight. But then the engineers and Sarah's team were able to come up with a system that involves reinforcing the floors so that that wouldn't be necessary, and that basically opened up the possibility of doing this piece. So even though we didn't have to cut through that top architectural concrete level, we still made a lot of use of that crawl space in between those two layers. And I think if we look at a floor plan here, or across a section of the floor, you can see that there is this kind of secret space, again, this kind of secret infrastructural space, which is really meant for the purpose of air circulation through the building. In this case, Sarah and her team were able to put it to a real structural use. So if you want to add anything to that?
So I will say, when you go into the galleries, I would take a look at the vents, because a lot of the work in assembling and installing this piece was time spent below the floor, which you will see here, and actually building a large kind of structural wedge that basically bridged between the structural slab, which is the slab at the bottom, and this metal decking, which is basically cosmetic and holds the wood floor above.
So there you go. You have a pretty good rundown of some of the challenges and really interesting discoveries that were made in the process of realizing this dream of creating elements that are capable of reorienting one sight line while also engaging the architecture and sort of making you rethink the way that you experience the building. And the result of that, you do the honors.
So we're experiencing the result of this with you, basically.
So for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to experience the work in the gallery, we have some time. The museum closes at 9. So please go on in and play in there. It's our greatest pleasure to see you interact with the work and experience its many surprises. So that's about it. I mean, there's so much more to talk about, really. But I'd just like to leave a few more minutes for questions. So please, anyone who has questions.
Hi. So I had a question, and I guess it's a sort of general question, but I had a couple of references regarding your work, and it comes from Descartes, and it comes from Kandinsky. And Descartes has this thing where, like, he said, God is like an equilateral triangle. Like, we don't see it in nature, but it exists. And somehow through mathematics, we know that. And then Kandinsky had like this whole theory about the spirituality in abstract shapes, which is like trying to grasp God, or human emotion from taking these shapes out of their functionality. So I guess, since we're all here for a limited amount of time, and eventually we're gonna die, if you can condense, what you love and want to convey in, trying to grasp all this perfection and technical play in your work, what would it be if there's any spiritual link or, to the people that are experiencing it? And that's it. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's such a fascinating question, Santi. I think that it's actually extraordinary to me that you'd ask that question about the work, because in some ways what's really fascinating for me at this moment, this evening, is to watch how people experience this, because I have never seen other people experience it, and I am just experiencing it myself. So the fact that that is the thing that you would find, it's really astounding and interesting, and I don't know that I have an answer to you. Well, I'm really surprised by how simple it is to shift the way we experience the world, and also how that then engages in so many people's work and thought. And I don't just mean a kind of abstract notion of an equilateral triangle, but I mean a really specific manual, physical, conceptual form of labor. And I think that there's something really extraordinary about that relationship, that you can have this very abstract notion, and that then becomes a very kind of concrete perceived condition, and then that also becomes a very lived, made kind of process. And I don't know that really answers that, but to me that is the thing that really is a very strong driver in my engagement with this work.
I think, for my part, something that I've always been interested in, I've always been interested in this topic that you raised, this idea of geometries existing in the universe and whatever connections there might be between them and the spiritual, right? These are things I don't know about, but what I've always found interesting is that there certainly is a very strong desire for us to see these things. We have a strong desire to perceive them, and we are actually hardwired in many ways to see them, to see these geometries and to react to them and to feel emotion when we see them. And I think that, that's a level in your work that, that really is, I think, just very strong and dominant in several installations that you've done. So, any other questions, please?
Yeah, it's on. Okay. Perhaps my question's kind of a follow-up to Santiago's. But what I saw when I was looking at this piece was this real kind of deconstruction of the space, and I started to think about more of an institutional critique. And I was wondering if that element is somehow also built into this process where you're kind of taking apart the building and reconfiguring it in some sort of way.
So I will try to respond to that. I probably have more to say to that than we have time for. I've been extremely interested in the history of institutional critique, basically for the past 20, 25 years. It's been one of the areas of art history that has most fascinated me. I feel like something that's increasingly apparent to me is that the entire notion of institution and what an institution that holds artwork does and means is has not only changed from when that term was initially coined, but has actually, is in the process of changing. We are in a moment of it changing. We are in an envelope of it that marks it changing. We are finding ourselves at a time where curators and artists are sort of shaped by and responding to and shaping the possibility of what that institution is. I'm also extremely interested in the kind of increasing globalization of the industry of architecture. And I think for me, one of the great fortunes of engaging with this building is finding the homology and also the sameness of this building with a number of HDM's buildings. I'm thinking specifically of a recent experience of passing through large international airports in Asia, then in the Middle East, and then in Europe, and finding that they're selling all the same goods out of all the same stores. And it's fascinating to me that that's also happening with these envelopes we call art institutions. So the ability to engage with this institution, and specifically the infrastructure of this institution, and by infrastructure I'm specifically referring to this recurrent lighting grid, is it's a great kind of semaphore for the larger questions you're asking.
And again, I'm sorry if you allow me to add something here. Also, these questions of the relationship between institutions and social power, class, etc. They're, first of all, very much inscribed in the architecture of museums, of institutions. And what's more, they're also experienced perceptually. So, I mean, indirectly, these kinds of social critiques. I mean, Sarah wrote her thesis on Hans Haacke, just to give you an idea that you are along on the right track here, and that it's a great question. But again, I think something that's really interesting and powerful about her work is that she is chasing those kinds of ideas and those critiques, but at a very, very deep fundamental level, at the level of pre-verbal perceptual experience, and that's one of the things that really drew me to her work from the beginning. Right. Any other questions?
Hi. Sarah, could you speak to I don't understand this for a few minutes, but the transformation of physically engaging in the pass-through of the spaces in some of your other projects, in relationship to this one where the transformation happens in front of you with one not passing through it in the same way. It's the physicality, the shift of the physicality.
Yes, so I think that's a great question. This is definitely feeling like a really exciting change in how I'm thinking about time. I think that there are a lot of times occurring, and there are different durations that we notice and don't notice. So, for example, this project and the specific desire, I think, for this to change states grew out of an interest in thresholds, and specifically an interest in doors. And thinking about how doors are not, in fact, the same as a threshold, but really have an active volition whereby one has the capacity, or one imagines one has the capacity to open or close that location. And I was very excited by that problem, and the potential for a kind of reoriented pivot had a lot to do with the circular motion or the rotational motion of a door. The other thing that I think is very important to this work, and is something that is growing out of a series of questions I have about this building, is that there is no built sort of architectural motif of the wall, because the space is all about this kind of open plan. So I became increasingly interested in this work operating within that openness and allowing the body to move, or the body to move through that space, but also the element to move. So there were these double times, or overlapping times, or choreographies of time, which had to do with you moving, the light changing, the building changing, the people around you moving, and also then that field of in front of you changing as well.
We never talked about the switch concept, which is really key here. It's the S in S28 1913 stands for switch. Would you like to just briefly kind of, it ties directly to what you were just talking about.
Yeah, so a lot of the rhetoric, I think, involved in contemporary architecture is growing out of notions of flow, this kind of one can choose their own path rather than be directed through what could be considered an enfilade, or more linearly progressive suite of rooms. I became both challenged by and interested in adjacencies that were not so much defined by doors, but were defined or are defined by zones of activity. You'll notice this is a really interesting space where you have a kind of open theater with also a massive stairway passing through the center of it. And I was very interested in the work not further subdividing the location, but in fact creating a new set of relays within this open plan. And that notion of taking a large series of flows and directing them on a kind of changing axis is where the term switch came from.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
I was curious, were you looking at Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion, as in the law of equal spaces creating equal intervals of time when you have a line through the sun, through the elliptical moving planets? The law of planetary motion, number 2.
No, but I would love to look at that. That's fascinating. So afterwards.
Sounds pretty cool. Here, maybe one more question, if anyone. Yeah. Okay, I think it looks like there's one more in the back.
So I actually wanted to ask you about the title. I noticed that a lot of the way that you approach your work is very scientific, almost like each work is like an attempt at working out a problem. And does that number, I mean, I know you talked about the S, but is the number, like, what does that mean to you? Why do you decide on naming your pieces that way?
So the number is based on each title is derived from a spreadsheet. And each number indicates the relationship of a certain variable to a set of adjacent locations. So you could have space A adjacent to space B, or space A adjacent to space B and C. And then you would have a series of things that would flow between them, such as sight lines or motion or airflow. and procession, and that is the numerical title.
Please join me in thanking Sarah and René.
Thank you.